Uh-huh.
Matt Palus, can you tell us a little bit about where you work?
Yeah, so I work for a cultural resources management firm in Montgomery County called the Ottery Group. And the work that I'm going to talk about today and that went into the Maryland Archaeology Month booklet was a project that Ottery worked on some years back. And then I also I teach in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Maryland. They have a new online only Master of Professional Studies in CRM, and I teach in that program as well.
Okay, great. So what's your favorite thing about your job?
Well, I appreciate that archaeology is a field science. And the less opportunity I have to do field work, the more I appreciate it. So I enjoy that. And then also, as a historical archaeologist, I really enjoy working with primary documents. I mean, I get excited about material culture and artifacts, but you know, documents are also material culture, and they get me every time. It's very engaging for me to try and piece together a story out of the well, our archival materials. That's a lot of fun for me.
Okay, so how did you get into archaeology in the first place, and what is it that keeps you engaged in it?
Yeah, so I was actually most of the way through a bachelor's in zoology, and one of my last electives was an archaeology class, and I really enjoyed it. And the last few credits of my degree from college was actually a field school at a historic site in Maine, and it was a good experience. And then just at the right time, a mentor in the anthropology department at the University of Maine said they thought I'd be good at archaeologist. You'd make a good archaeologist. And when someone says that to you at just the right time, I think you're good at this. It affects you, and that kind of did it. And also seeing graduate students in anthropology, uh, doing laboratory work or whatever, and you could see that they loved what they were doing, and I wanted a career where I couldn't imagine doing anything else, and that's what I saw in archaeology was it. And also teaching, I really enjoy the opportunities to teach students and mentor graduate students. So that's also a, a pleasure and a passion, I guess.
Interesting. Everybody has a slightly different story, so it's kind
Yeah,
of good to hear all these different stories from folks.
yeah.
So tell us about your Maryland Archaeology Month topic.
Okay, yeah. So again, this is, I'm not even sure how long ago. I think this was 2013, 2014. Um, the Ottery Group was hired by the Maryland State Highway Administration to do some investigations around the town of Benedict in Charles County. And it was coming up on actually, this must have been earlier. Well, darn it. Anyway, it was coming up on the anniversary of the 1814 British attack on Washington during the War of 1812. And one of the known archaeological sites that was present in the area was Camp Stanton, and Camp Stanton was a recruiting and training camp, or a camp of instruction for what was called the U.S. Colored Troops, African American troops who were recruited by the Union in Maryland. 9,000 African Americans were recruited into the Union Army in Maryland during the Civil War, starting in 1863, I think. And slavery was legal in Maryland until a change in the state's constitution in November of 1814. So this was Union recruiters taking black men out of slavery with a commitment to compensate their owners. This was called compensated emancipation, and it was required because owning another person's property was legal in Maryland. And unaffected by the Emancipation Proclamation, and so forth. So this effort started in Baltimore, but recruiting moved to areas of Maryland with farms and plantations with larger slave holdings. And Camp Stanton was established in Charles County for exactly this reason. So it was established in an area of Maryland where people still very much invested in slavery, committed to slavery. And abolitionist William Birney was a Union officer. He led the recruitment effort. He took men off of those farms. The men were freed, And before leaving Benedict and entering the war with the regiments that he'd raised, some of them, Bernie saw that their families were moved to Washington so that they would not be re-enslaved after the Union, essentially left the Union troops, I should say, left the area. So just to tie it in with the theme of Maryland Archaeology Month, disease is just a fact of camp life. And it affected African American recruits disproportionately. The real killer was pneumonia in sequence with measles. People weakened by measles infection then succumbed to pneumonia, and it was really a lethal combination. And without being able to say how many recruits were lost at Camp Stanton, we know that around 20,000 African American troops in the Union Army succumbed to disease and died. And that's about 17% of all of the African Americans that were recruited into the U.S. colored troops during the Civil War. So it was really consequential. And many recruits died in Benedict after hospitalization, and they were buried in Benedict. And actually, William Birney, the officer in charge of the camp, he lost one of his children during the winter of 1863 to 1864, and his son was buried in the cemetery alongside the recruits who died at camp. And later, his son was moved to a family cemetery, and all of the African American recruits were moved to the federal cemetery at Arlington. Thanks. Sorry. So a part of this, disproportionate effects of disease, the Union recruits who were African American were largely kept out of battle, and that's not completely kept out of battle, but there was a lot of racial and white supremacist ideology at work in every part of this, and there was a presumption that African American troops were inferior. And there was also a presumption that emancipation is part of what was making them sick, or at least that was a hypothesis that doctors and physicians and the whole field was testing. And conversely, there was not a lot of confidence among African American recruits who were struck ill that Army physicians really wanted to help them recover from disease, and there was significant sort of mistrust. And doctors of the period note, that there was sort of a surrender to disease once a recruit was hospitalized. And to tie it into the archaeology, and I have a couple of slides that I can show, and I guess I can put this up now. One of the discoveries that was really exciting. So the site of Camp Stanton. Let me see how I do this. The archaeological site at Camp Stanton was present now. Window. That one. Okay. Matt, can you see this? Okay.
Yep, I can see it.
Excellent. Okay. So there wasn't a lot of militaria found at the site of Camp Stanton, which is remarkable because they trained something like 3,000 troops in every aspect of military life. The site had been it's agricultural fields. The site of Camp Stanton was pretty well known, and what we think is that it was picked over by metal detectorists and relic hunters for decades. So that I think we didn't find more than a dozen bullets and very little else that could be linked with the Civil War context. That is to say, we brought our own metal detectorists and detected the entire location in an effort to locate the camp. And one thing that we did find is an area that had some promise. So we brought in heavy equipment and stripped off the plowed soils, and right at the interface of the plowed soil and the subsoil, we could discern these rectangular sort of outlines or footprints of what we presume to be the winter shelters that were erected by recruits over that winter of 1863 to 1864. And this is sort of this is a diagram that shows the positions and the arrangement of just 4 of those winter shelters that were identified. But there's enough of this presumably out there to house, 3,000 or so recruits who are trained at the camp over those months. And this is what the things looked like. They were really ephemeral, really difficult to discern. But one thing that was especially exciting is each of them had some trace of a hearth. At one end of the structure, and it's on the same end of the structure for each of these features, the eastern end of the structure. So there's some order and regimentation. And this is the 2 best examples of these hearths that are associated with these winter shelters. But there's the winter shelters, there's the hearths, and what we or the connection to the theme of Maryland Archaeology Month this year is how do these African American recruits to the Union Army support their own health and well-being in the face of a really considerable threat from disease, and especially respiratory disease. So these hearths created the right conditions inside of these shelters to recover from respiratory congestion and respiratory illness. They dried out the air, and that's a very simple measure, but a powerful one. And again, thinking about the disposition of formerly enslaved people now recruited into the military, the disposition towards the army hospital. The idea that these were pretty important spaces. So I'm just going to stop sharing, and you can come back to my face. So anyway, that's there was a lot of other there were a number of other archaeological sites that were encountered around Benedict, during the same period of field work, but this is the one that grabbed me, and I'll never forget.
Very cool. Very interesting. So considering the COVID-19 pandemic, how do you think that this research is relevant today?
Yeah, well, I mean, COVID, it's a virus, and it doesn't see race, but it's affected non-whites disproportionately, and with this Civil War context that we investigated along with the State Highway Administration. Julie Shablitsky was the principal on the project. Medicine in America really first became concerned with treating Black people in the context of recruitment of African Americans into the Union Army. So there were African American physicians before the Civil War. Absolutely there were. But the medical profession on the whole matured significantly because of the Civil War. It sort of created this massive access to study disease in a rigorous way, and it also created a massive and very much a new access to Black bodies and understand their capacities, and attempt to and again, because racial ideology and white supremacist thought was so thoroughgoing, even among abolitionists. They sort of fell into sort of some fallacious ideas about, what it meant for Black people to be ill. That the entire effort to combat disease is sort of sharply affected by these ideas, and it's there at the beginnings of American medicine, and it's still is still powerful in American life. Racial difference affects the progression of the pandemic that we're living through, and it affected the progression of disease, in this context, 150 years ago. So that's the relevance. It's not the same thing. It's not history repeating itself. I never say that, and I really dislike when people say that. But but it's uh, I don't want to say living through the same history, because we live in a very different context today. But the ideas that started 150 years ago, there's still something that we're struggling with.
Okay. So what's the first thing that you want to do once COVID is over? Once we can all finally emerge out of our houses and engage with the world again?
Yeah, visit my parents. Both my folks are still alive, and I was, as we all came to grips with the idea that this is gonna go on for a year or maybe more. We still don't know when it's gonna end. Um, I'm both of my folks were inoculated earlier this year, and I'm very happy thinking about a time soon we'll bring the kids and visit them both. That's the big one.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, that's my pleasure, Matt. It's good talking with you. Okay.
Yeah.